First of all, let me just say it's a real honor and privilege for CCDH to be here at this event. CCDH is now 5 years and 6 or 7 days old as an organization. About 5.5 years ago, I went for dinner with someone and I asked him whether or not I should set up an organization to deal with this information disorder that I saw as being a problem around the world. And he said to me, "You can't win any battle if you're not on the battlefield." And you know, CCDH, we knew that we were up against tough opposition. We've, in fact, as some of you know, been sued by some of the tough opposition, by Elon Musk last year, and won those battles. But what's really exciting about being here in the middle of New York at the UN is that we are expanding that battlefield too and bringing in new voices, new assets, new movements, and the incredible power of the United Nations itself to this question. So what is the question that we're here to address? Let me start by telling you a story about two revolutions. Bear with me on this. The first was the Industrial Revolution, central to which has been carbonization of our economies. And it has made our world more productive, more prosperous, more advanced than ever before. However, an unintended externality, the slow, steady accrual of CO2, has degraded our physical ecosystem, leading to the climate crisis today. That is one of the main reasons why all of us cohere in New York for this week. The second revolution is the digital revolution, the information revolution, which is as profound, much younger. It, too, has fueled an unparalleled improvement in our lives. And yet again, a systemic, unintended negative externality, the slow accrual of hate, lies, disinformation in our information ecosystem, dripping into our eyes, poisoning perceptions and cognition, has led to a crisis, an epistemic crisis that we face today, that imperils the values that allow open, prosperous societies to cohere and function. You know, it doesn't matter which policy issue is central to your concerns about the future. Fixing the disorder in our information ecosystem has become integral to the solution. If you care about climate, then you worry about a tidal wave of climate disinformation designed to undermine the scientific consensus astride which our ecosystem of analysis and solutions sits. If you care about gender inequality, then you worry about social media algorithms promoting misogyny and being hijacked by bad actors to spread disinformation about abortions. If you care about conflict resolution or peace or anti-Semitism or anti-LGBTQ+ hate, then you worry about polarization and the amplification of hate speech, which makes our societies feel less safe, more polarized, sclerotic, harder to cohere. So how is this happening? Well, look, good information is as vital to the body politic as good nutrition is to our physical bodies. Digital spaces have become, if not the, then certainly a primary locus for a vast array of interpersonal and social, even societal and global relationships. They are where we as people exchange information, where we maintain and create new relationships, transact business, set our social mores, our norms of attitude and behavior, where we negotiate our values, where even now we negotiate the corpus of information that we call facts. But connecting people wasn't enough for the companies, the small number of companies, the cartel that controls these new digital spaces. You don't become a centibillionaire through free speech. That's why they invented the algorithmic timeline, and that is at the core of the problem that we face today. Are highly manufactured timelines designed to addict us, to scare us, to trigger us, to emotionally react, according to our unique psychology that they track, evaluate, and monitor constantly? The content that scares us, that makes us appalled, confused, or enraged is also the most profitable, and that is at the heart of the problem. Drip, 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 keeping us hooked, watching ads. 98% of the revenues come from those ads, which are generated by, which are driven by those artificially generated timelines. For the oligarchs in Silicon Valley, this insatiable greed for profit at the expense of our communities, our kids, our open societies, continues unimpeded. They have been implicated in a genocide in Southeast Asia, in Myanmar. They cause our little girls to look at their bodies in disgust and whisper in their ears that they should go on a 500-calorie-a-day diet, as we discovered that TikTok's algorithm did in our study Deadly by Design. They make women believe that abortions will render them infertile. They make some believe that climate change is a hoax. They make some of our young men believe that men and women cannot coexist without violence and domination characterizing those relationships. They persuaded millions of people that a vaccine that might save their lives would harm them instead. And hundreds of thousands of those people choked to death in ICUs in this country too, 200,000 unnecessarily, begging too late for a vaccine that they once had so feared. We need to do something. This is a broken market, a global market that is harming people. That's precisely what these spaces are created to do, to cohere our understanding and to drive our responses. So what can we do? CCDH's central argument laid out in our STAR framework is that we need checks and balances. That's it. Social media has become a rare, uniquely potent, and fundamentally unchecked locus of power in our complex interwoven world. In a world in which we realize that institutions need checks and balances, and we've built our societies, our democracies are in that mold. Unchecked loci of power are inherently dangerously corruptible. In fact, our history suggests that they inevitably, as an iron rule, become corrupted. Social media has, thanks to US law in particular, and the failure of lawmakers and policymakers around the world, become an unchecked locus of extraordinary power that controls vast arrays of human interaction within our societies. And it's particularly harmful to open societies and democracies. That's why those values of open society are at the heart of the STAR framework. Transparency, which allows for meaningful discourse and accountability, a core institutional value in democracies. And then for responsibility for dealing with the harms, not just to be placed on the victims, but on the perpetrator too, which is a core value of justice, of the jurisprudence of the United States and many other countries around the world. But it's not just an institutional problem. This is also a personal battle for many of us too, many of my staff. You know, growing up, my grandfather would tell me about Afghanistan, which is the country I come from. I'm Pashtun. And he would tell me how rapidly it descended from having women in government to being a failed state. Yeah, all people die. All civilizations fall. All come from dust, and to dust shall return, right? And it can happen quickly. I began to feel the ground shake under my own feet in Britain when I worked as a senior advisor in Parliament. First, in the wake of Brexit and its rampant disinformation campaigns. Second, the explosion of anti-Semitism in my own party, the Labour Party. And third, and most painfully, in the brutal murder of Jo Cox, a member of Parliament and mother of two, who was shot, beaten, and stabbed to death by a member of the far right who had been radicalized in part online. In every election cycle since then across the democratic world, we've realized that none of us are immune to the repercussions of accelerated hate, lies, and conspiracy. I mentioned that my work is rooted in grief. That is true. But I'm also optimistic that we can win. And that's mainly thanks to the people in this room and on our panel today. From civil society to government, to multilaterals to philanthropy, we are seeing the seeds of bold, creative, urgent action taking shape. The UN, under Melissa Fleming, the Under-Secretary General for Communications, and the Special Envoy for Technology and his advisor, Renata Dwan. The Skoll Foundation, one of the world's most well-known philanthropies, which has elevated information integrity to a portfolio of its own. Crucially, not treating us as perpendicular or orthogonal to other concerns, but turning it on its side and saying this is actually something that has to be dealt with in itself, a core concern of global society. Anne-Marie Slaughter, who's brought the issues of disinformation, state weaponization of digital lies and hate, and its impact on democracy and global peace, to Washington's power elites, broadcast studios, and the most influential policy spaces in the world. It's a truly formidable panel, too short a time for this important discussion, which is why we must continue this discussion in the weeks and months ahead, and I look forward to taking part in that discussion with all of you. If I can invite our speakers up on the stage. Under Secretary General for Communications at the UN, for Global Communications at the UN, how's the UN approaching improving the information ecosystem?
Well, Imran, first of all, thank you for that impassioned talk that you just gave. I mean, we need to communicate the dangers as well as the solutions, as well as we suffer from them. I have to say, I've been in this, you went back on your history and when you first encountered mis and disinformation. In my career, I've worked on democratic institutions, peace and security, refugees, and now, here in this global arena at the UN. And always in communications and always, looking at the ecosystems. Disinformation and hate speech have always existed. But as you so well described, I have never been in a situation of having to try to communicate in an environment that is so toxic and is actively working against the forces for good. So we had no choice, but as the UN, but to start to take action. It wasn't only to get more strategic about how we communicate. I see that that's one of your pillars and one of your missions through communications. We can shape the debate, we can educate, we can deliver facts. That is my responsibility as head of communications at the UN, to inform the world about the state of the world, about the statistics of human suffering, the data around climate change, how many people are dying in wars. But we have the we now have to communicate in a way that is going to not just break through the noise, but also navigate through the disinformation and the hate. And in a way, we just became so exhausted by it. Why are we doing this? We even discovered along the way that UN content was being downranked on the very platforms, that we thought were big opportunities to reach people far and wide. We were being attacked online. Our issues, as you mentioned, every single issue, every single SDG is impacted by disinformation or hate speech. So in short, and hopefully we'll have more time to talk about it, but we introduced global principles, UN global principles on information integrity, which we believe is a blueprint for how to arrive at a healthy information ecosystem. It's very aligned with what you're calling for. It's safety by design, transparency. Let's elevate trusted information and design algorithms that are not going to harm us, but be there for the greater good. So there is a prescription there, and I'm really pleased that my colleague Renata is here, because today the Global Digital Compact was also just adopted in these halls. I also see that I have a colleague here from UNESCO, the Assistant Director General, who has introduced fantastic guidelines for regulators. And we have civil society actors, academics, think tanks, all working together, and we need to come together. So I am optimistic that we can make some progress in this area. We don't have any time to lose.
Thank you, Melissa. Anne-Marie, if I can come to you next. How does the erosion of the information ecosystem impact democratic resilience? It's an issue that you've worked on for many years.
It is. I'm tempted to start by saying, let me count the ways. So, in many ways, but I think there are three really key ones. I mean, democracies cannot flourish without a base level of trust, right? You can always have parties, and those parties can disagree strenuously, but there has to be a sense that in the American legal system, there are legitimate differences and then there are illegitimate differences. There are differences that are just beyond the pale, claiming that fellow citizens are subhuman or not human, that's not a legitimate difference of view. That is something that a democracy, a commonwealth cannot survive if you allow that. So the first thing, this kind of extreme speech, just violent speech, outrageous speech, all of our outrage meters are constantly on high. Definitely, it undermines that fundamental trust, because you no longer sort of have this sense that we're all playing by the same rules with the same basic platform. And then accountability. When people say these things and they are not stopped, and there are many reasons why we protect certain kinds of speech, but there's a sense of anything goes. Anybody can say anything, and that then gives you this feeling that there is no way to hold people accountable. Individuals, companies, for the algorithms, and you can't have democracy without accountability, without rule of law. And then finally, I think I actually heard this as you were talking, it increases hopelessness. You feel like if you can't even agree on some basic facts. So when you think about climate change, and there you are, amid wildfires and floods and all the things that the scientists predicted, and we still have a large number of people who either deny that it's happening or deny that it has anything to do with fossil fuel, you feel like you can't fight. So those are the ways, some of the ways, really important ways that it undermines democracy. I'll also just point out, when we think about dis and misinformation, or the cracks in information integrity, and I love the way you frame information integrity, there are two big categories, and one is false speech and one is hate speech, and they are not the same. Right? And we need to fight them differently, because false speech, again, it undermines, we can't do anything, we can't govern ourselves without some basis of common fact. But hate speech is deliberately targeted at specific groups, often already marginalized groups, sometimes depending on the society, roughly equal groups. But the point is, there are specific victims of hate speech. When the hate speech in this country, when you're trying to elect one party or another, there are real consequences for individuals who are going to then be targeted by one regime or by a specific regime. So I want to call that out, because in thinking about how to fight it, I think it's very important we make that distinction. The last thing I'll just say, though, is, because I don't want to end on total hopelessness, I love the information integrity, because integrity is a wonderful word. It actually, in English, it doesn't have an adjective form. We don't say something is integrous. You do in French, but not in English. The adjective is whole. And so part of what we need to push is that really a healthy, sound, whole information environment is a place where you get information from more than one source. That we, instead of always trying to fix the source, we need to be educating people to say, if you got that from one source or two sources that were the same, you're not getting. You should challenge that information, because really well-informed people hear from multiple sources and then they make up their own mind.
Thank you. Just to make the point on the idea of integrity, I always think about it in terms of nutrition. If we handed over the world's food to 5 companies run by people who are far too wealthy to understand the lives of normal people around the world, and their primary incentive was to keep people as addicted as possible to their food. They had no transparency obligations. They don't have to tell us what their ingredients are. They don't have to tell us how they process the food. Can you imagine the chaos that would ensue? And of course, that's what we've done to our intellectual nutrition, the information that informs us and theoretically gives us, through which we impart the values that underpin our democracies, underpin our societies.
And allow anybody to add ingredients at will to those foods.
Precisely. So just shove it, and it's all natural. And they say it's freedom of speech. It's all natural ingredients. I'm like, arsenic's all natural ingredient too. It's just a naturally occurring element. This is a big tragedy of the commons. This is a big collective issue for us, and the UN clearly has to be a player at the heart of this. Renata, can you tell the audience about the Global Digital Compact and how it is addressing digital trust and safety?
Yeah, thank you. And let me also say that it is a day for celebration, because today, the Global Digital Compact, 2 years in the making, was approved and agreed by 193 member states. And many of you, I know, in the room contributed to it. We're at the meetings, we're at the months meetings. So it's a first, and we should clap ourselves on the back. And why is it a first? It's a first because it is the first comprehensive global framework for digital cooperation. And we've had resolutions and we've had frameworks before, but they've looked at something specific: human rights and digital technologies, children online safety. We've not had a comprehensive approach that looks at everything from the connectivity right up to the AI governance, with specific actions in digital trust and safety and information integrity. That's a big deal. And why is it a big deal? It's a big deal because if we're going to address this tragedy of the commons, it's not going to be through any one action. It's going to be through a holistic approach, from how we think about educating our children, our citizens, so that people can critically address information, to how do we hold companies accountable, to what do we think about the roles of governments in ensuring that digital trust and safety principles and standards are established and implemented, but in ways that are rights respecting and facilitate that pluralistic space that you said. And I think it's shown that our countries collectively, despite their differences and despite this very geopolitically divided world in which information is used as part of the battleground online, what we're seeing is the experience that an unregulated digital space, what the implications are. And we've seen that the market incentives, there's a market failure on digital trust and information. And so what we're seeing in the GDC is a recognition that we must come together to nudge digital technologies in directions that are enabling, that are in directions that facilitate information integrity, not undermine it, and sets out a roadmap to achieve that. Now, I want to be really clear. It is the first step. It is not the last step. But I think it's a really important roadmap for us each to take forward. And while I recognize, Imran, the points you've said about the monopoly of big tech and the drivers of the recommendation algorithms, and the Digital Compact commits companies to communicate transparently about their recommendation algorithms, require consent, put it in languages, and consult with users on how they're about those recommendations. So it brings transparency to a new level. But I would just note that we are not going to get the solutions about protecting the information space if we're not working together. So the very same actors that are our challengers are also part of the solution. And I would just want to think about how do we go forward in that collaborative way, collectively. And that's hopefully what the UN can do, create the space for that collaborative problem solving.
Thank you, Renata. I am turning now to Marla. I mean, the Skoll Foundation, which is one of the world's most well-known philanthropies, set up by Jeff Skoll, the founding CEO of eBay. It has elevated information integrity to a grant-making portfolio of its own, so providing cutting-edge support for our movement, for our growing, our young, our callow movement, bringing some of the sharpest and brightest minds to help with our cause. Can you tell us why Skoll invests in information integrity? How does it impact your other priorities as a foundation?
Thank you, Imran. And it's a pleasure to be here and get to spend some time with all of you on this critically important topic. I just have to pause and say this is a good-looking group, so I'm very excited to be here. It's nice to see you all. I would describe what we see in information integrity as something that's like a bump in your house and you just keep tripping over it, right? You keep trying to walk around and you keep just sort of falling over the same thing over and over and over again, and eventually you actually have to deal with it, right? And that's sort of how this came up for us. In our work in democracy, in climate, in justice and equity, in global health and pandemics prevention, we kept coming into a situation where the quality and caliber of information that was available was part of the challenge, right? Was part of the opportunity and part of what was being used to create chaos, to undermine progress, right? To prevent treatment. That sort of seemed to be a systemic issue of its own that we constantly ran into. And what we discovered is that if you're working on democracy, at the intersection of democracy and information integrity is a place where there's opportunity to drive change. If you're working on administering and helping people to embrace a vaccine, Imran, as you were talking about earlier, the information that is available to the people making those choices is an opportunity for intervention. We kept coming across that idea, and it ended up becoming sort of a constant theme, right? A constant thematic piece. And in part of our team is here, we've been exploring how we might make that a standalone issue of its own, right? We started making a few grants to learn in this space in 2021 and 2022. And then in 2023, we decided we were going to make this a major part as a standalone piece of what we're doing to drive change, right? To build the world of peace and prosperity for all. That is our mission that we focus on. We continue to learn, right? We continue to evolve. It is not necessarily easy to figure out how you engage on the integrity of information itself in the absence of other context, right? Whether that other context is about healthcare or is about justice and equity. The information and how information is distributed, how information gets determined, and whether and how people can verify, right, or validate the information that's at their disposal. So Anne-Marie, one of the things you mentioned was people being able to make their own choices based on the information that they take in. But one of the challenges is where and how are people taking in information, right? And what is the validity and reliability of that central source? Getting people to experience and take in multiple sources, right? All of these are part and parcel of the challenge. So as we go about and have started down this path of making this a standalone focus for us, we've identified a few key areas that includes organizations like yours, and Imran, your work has been phenomenal in this space. But we look for opportunities to help, right? To help people reject disinformation, right? To be able to mitigate the harm and build resilience. Those are the kinds of interventions we like. We're looking for access to accurate, trusted information, right? Finding ways to highlight, elevate, right? Make those more readily available. We would like to see a shift in the incentive structure in our social media environment, especially, right? Where their incentive is to keep you engaged. Oftentimes people will engage with negative content, right? Setting up incentives where there might be a return associated with healthy information, right? A return associated with something that applies to building rather than tearing down. Those are things we look for. So an example is just looking for something that focuses on the public good, right? And enabling that, that avoidance of these sort of unhelpful, toxic, harmful, polarizing information that can stand in that place. So our engagement here is, again, still something that we are exploring and learning, but those are the kinds of questions we ask ourselves. Those are the kinds of actors that we are seeking in this space. We continue to look at this at the intersection of the areas that I highlighted before, but we believe that if we can't fix this, it becomes almost impossible to work on democracy or to work on pandemics and health systems or to work on justice and equity in a standalone when there is such lack of agreement and discord in the information around us. So I describe it as there has to be hygiene in that area, right, first and foremost. And if we can fix that, then we can continue the work in all of these other areas. But this is sort of table stakes in getting this to happen.
I just want.
No, you go first.
I wanted just to really echo everything that Marla said and say that in our consultations over a year and a half on the GDC, and I know this echoes with your work, Melissa and Taufik, on the guidelines and principles on information integrity, we really did hear from so many communities that how you receive that information is critical. So we really heard a call for linguistic diversity being really critical, and then identifying where's the source of that information. And that looks and feels different in different countries, different regions, different communities. So I think one of the consistent messages coming from the Global Digital Compact is we need to think about not just the sources of information and how they're delivered, but by whom they're delivered and in what formats, languages, systems, mechanisms. So I think it's just fleshing out that aspect of pluralism that we need to think about.
So I was thinking as you were talking about how do you implant healthy skepticism without cynicism? Because you want, if you think about, I'm a law professor originally in law school, obviously you learn to make arguments on both sides. You come to automatically think when you hear an argument, what is the argument on the other side? And sometimes you can carry that on with yourself for a long time, but that's the scientific method. Right? At the same time, it's an automatic questioning that should be at the heart, again, of a good education. But how do you implant that? Because very quickly, you do get to the cynicism where, oh, it doesn't matter. Nothing is true. I wanted to ask you, though, if you thought about other means of creating demand for accurate information. So if you flip it and you think, I'm looking at all the SDGs there on the wall, and think, if you get people working on those, they'll say, well, we need accurate information about who's food insecure, or we need, and so then you have to work the demand side too, I think, although I think it's hard.
I think that's very well framed. And one of the little experiments that I did, I was speaking to a group of young people, probably college age or very early college, and I asked them how many of them pay for any information, right? Who pays for a subscription to anything? And literally, we have created a generation of people that think that information is free, that they should not pay for anything. And I could not come up with a single thing they pay for. Even their parents were paying for their cell phone bills, right? Like there was no paying
Forever.
anything. Yeah, exactly. That's right. Forever.
Maybe Netflix.
Exactly. But that is a major problem, right? I was accustomed to paying for information, and that gave me some sense that there was investment in the quality and caliber of that information. And without that, as we all have learned, right, we are the product if the product is free. And this idea of freedom and having coached and developed and created a population that is accustomed to not having to pay for for access to any kind of information, we have an uphill battle, right, to work on getting to a place where quality, verified information, reliable information, where somebody has gone through the exercise you're talking about of thinking about what this is from, where this is from. We are going to have to do a lot of work to get to a place where that's available, because we've created the conditions where it won't become available.
If I just may add there, I think that is so true. And on one hand, it may have been a mistake of the media when social media came onto the scene, that they were all very excited that this could be an amazing distribution channel. We've heard this from Maria Ressa, who relied completely on Facebook for Rappler to distribute all of her news until that didn't work anymore. So for a while it was free, and then the algorithm was switched to de-emphasize news, de-emphasize anything that was regarded as kind of political content or social. And that includes, by the way, United Nations content. And soon the business model of many of the newspapers and news organizations that were providing trusted information just was completely upended and collapsed. And what we saw when we did surveys in countries around the world, particularly in the global south, where already public interest media or independent media were standing on shaky legs, being attacked, and we were seeing extinction events in many countries. So you can imagine this infusion of social media as the only source, people coming online for the first time, sometimes through these kind of free Facebook initiatives that were, you can get online for free, but just the only catch is it's through Facebook, and then whatever, that's what happened in Myanmar, you mentioned, where, and there was all of a sudden this gap in, okay, the sources of independent and trusted media were collapsing, and this cool new tool with all of these people that they thought that they could possibly trust were coming in to fill the gap. And we need and one of the things that we propose in the Global Digital Compact is really to boost trusted public interest media again. We need to invest in it, and also to ask them, those who do call themselves media and journalists, to live up to the standards of their industry. So it is a factor. It's part of the architecture of the global, of the information ecosystem, and it's one that we need to restore to better health.
Thank you all. I mean, if I could make an observation that resilience is obviously a critical part of the battle, but we must be humble at the same time as encouraging resilience, and remember that anyone can believe disinformation. One of my favorite little tricks in speeches is to ask the crowd, which I'll do now, which vegetable gives you better night vision? Anyone? Carrots, right. So that is World War II disinformation produced by the British Secret Intelligence Service to hide the fact that we developed plane-mounted radar, which is how we were shooting the Germans down at night. And 80 years later, we still believe that in our societies, that if you eat carrots, you get better night vision. Here's the funny thing. Any of you going to go home and tell your kids they don't have to eat their carrots? These things are sticky. And I think remembering that anyone can fall for disinformation, it's been a part of our societies for a long time. The difference now, of course, is that disinformation is profitable because it's sticky, making people feel that they live in a Hobbesian reality in which everyone next to them could be a threat, that the world is more scary, is more dark and calcified. That is actually incredibly profitable to those companies. And I wonder, I admire what you say, Renata. I agree with you that we have to work with these companies. I see the role of CCDH quite specifically as being an outside voice. We are the ones who drive people to those discussions and build that awareness. But how do you think, what are the mechanisms through which we can bring these companies and responsible executives at these companies into the discussions that we need to have to deal with what is quite clearly a growing tragedy with more and more sort of externalities being observed every day?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a tough question, because we're seeing right now in the experience of the EU about hefty fines around recommendation algorithms and their implications for discrimination, for unfair competition, for unfair pricing. Companies that have huge profits can afford to pay those fines. So we're looking at, can incentives through the sticks, I'm going to leave the carrots aside now, but the sticks, can they do anything? We're seeing of limited consequence. And so I would see the question in perhaps another twist. Trust is now becoming a critical enabler for any forms of AI developments, because trust is going to be essential for people to share their data. Trust is going to be essential to create the drivers for AI governance, for AI machine learning developments. You've got to have the data. And as companies are being forced, sometimes by law, by the EU Digital Services Act as a leader in that area, by public pressure and other ways from organizations like yourselves to have informed consent, you're seeing the potential of individuals and societies, communities withholding trust. And that does, I think, and withholding consent for their data information. So precisely the drive for data and the drive for where we are now with companies can potentially be an incentive to see trust as an enabler that is essential to their business model. And I think we have to work on that area as well. The second is, I think we need to really work at creating collaborative spaces, and the UN is one, and I think the work of UNESCO and Melissa's team and the global communications is going to be critical to drive collaborative networks of veracity, of safe information space, and how around specific issues, whether it's around climate, whether it's around SDGs. And you are seeing this communities at all sorts of levels, at national, local, regional, and international, moving in that direction. And I think that's where we can try to encourage governments to promote and create that. So that's what I mean by a collaborative effort.
Yeah. Actually, keep going.
Can I add to that? Yeah, I really like what Renata said, and the role of government and the creation of the right guardrails and the right rules of the road around this are critical, and market forces are also a big part of potentially getting their attention, right? So if there is a threat of some other platform, right? Some new innovation. We are watching artificial intelligence evolve rapidly right in front of our eyes. If they believe themselves to be threatened or are in fact actually threatened, that will bring them into this conversation with light speed. And I think by setting up incentives, by engaging in some of the innovation economies, by bringing newly minted technology entrepreneurs into a space where they create technology for good, and they actually have some incentive by the capital providers to build other kinds of systems that might actually function differently and disintermediate the existing ones. Because we've seen, right, social media is not permanent. Anybody remember having a MySpace page? Will remember, right, that I see some blank looks. Some people are like, MySpace, what is...
Even young?
Young people are like, what are you even talking about? Yeah, but they're not permanent, right? There are new threats that come in, and setting up incentives that allow those threats to emerge is another key, along with this government guidance and control.
Before Emery comes in, just really briefly on that, just to add, I mean, one of the calls to action in our UN Global Principles is also to PR companies and advertising companies, and that is, you know, it's really hard to understand why they would advertise in these spaces, because they have through this programmatic advertising system, very little control of where their ads land. I know Imran's organization has tracked a lot of these ads and pointed out to big brands that they're appearing next to misogynist, hateful, anti-Semitic content, and yet but there is a growing movement to expose this, and the more pressure that we put on the platforms to provide that transparency, and also for brands, just, you know, demand to land next to, you know, in traditional media, they would never put an ad in the places where they're often adding now. This can go a long way to cleaning up the feeds that we're seeing that are so hateful and awful. I know Imran feels passionate about that, but I interrupted Anne-Marie.
No, I, as you were talking, I was thinking one of the other weapons we have is interoperability. And I don't think we've done nearly enough with that. When you think about that with your cell phone, you know, if you couldn't port your number, you'd never change cell phone companies. And we insisted that you could. And particularly as smaller competition comes up, you need a combination of antitrust where you prevent acquisition, right? You say, okay, you've got what you've got, but you can't just keep gobbling up the competition. And then you force interoperability so there aren't all these closed ecosystems. You know, if you left Facebook what would you do? Because all your contacts are there. So there are other legal tools also I think we can still use.
Thank you. And just in that final question, I felt that we started to explore some of the diversity of solution sets that could be brought to this problem. It's going to require a multiplicity of approaches. Same with the climate crisis. We wouldn't say there's only one way to fix it. We try everything because it's a crisis. And there is a crisis right now in the information ecosystem. We are in a year of elections that have seen the autocracies push. I remember I was at Cambridge when Fukuyama wrote that book about the end of history. And I remember, the arrogance, the hubris that we all thought that we'd won. Liberal democracy was the way forwards. And that wouldn't be something we would all agree with in 2024, would it? We have a common set of problems to deal with. I am incredibly grateful to this panel, to the audience, to the UN for creating a space and for putting information integrity on the global stage, to SKOL for its vision, its leadership in funding the growing nascent ecosystem, for helping us to mature, to grow as leaders, as individuals. I've only been doing this for 5 years. It is still so important for those with experience to help us along the way, to Renata for her leadership just today with the Global Digital Compact, and Anne-Marie, who I suspect to at least half of this room is a personal hero, and it's such an honor to meet you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, all.